Uh, Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on Getting PPPs Right, the Road to Sustainable Infrastructure Investments. So we are thrilled to have you here today to join us at this very insightful session, jointly organized by the Advocata Institute and the Alliance for Sustainable Infrastructure, or ASI. So for those of you who don't know, Advocata Institute is an independent policy think tank based in Colombo, dedicated to economic development through free markets. We conduct research, provide commentary, and hold events to promote sound policy ideas compatible with a free society in Sri Lanka. The Alliance for Sustainable Infrastructure, which was established in 2021, is a voluntary coalition of civil society organizations and individuals working together to ensure that public expenditures on large-scale infrastructure in Sri Lanka reflect public interest as well as reinforce participatory governance. So my name is Yasmin, and I will be your MC and your moderator for the day. So before we begin, I would like to just inform you all, especially those listening in through Zoom, please feel free to use the chat functions to share any of your thoughts as well as any questions that you might have on this topic. For those of you joining in through YouTube or through our Facebook, please use the chat comment section to do the same. So we will be having a dedicated Q&A session later. Where we will basically get our panelists to answer your questions and any clarifications that you might have on the current status of PPPs in Sri Lanka. So to start off our event, I would really like to introduce my colleague, Ms. Nirmali Amarasekara. So she's a member of our Advocata research team, and she will basically present the key findings from our joint policy brief that we developed with ASI. Titled The Role of Public-Private Partnerships as a Sustainable Alternative for Infrastructure Investments, Public Infrastructure Investments in Sri Lanka. So we hope the presentation will set the tone for our discussion today. So yeah, Nirmali, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Yasmin. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Nirmali Amarasekara. My presentation today will be summarizing the key points in our policy brief jointly developed with ASI, titled The Role of Public-Private Partnerships as a Sustainable Alternative to Public Infrastructure Investments in Sri Lanka. So first, let's take a look at why it's important for us to talk about PPPs in the current context. For one, public infrastructure projects have been a significant contributor of public finance mismanagement over the years. For instance, between the years 2006 and 2019, borrowings to fund these projects made up about 14% of our country's GDP. Secondly, by 2020, Sri Lanka had already lost access to capital markets due to credit downgrades. And with the economic crisis, this situation worsened following the debt default in 2022, making traditional financing methods like project bonds, thematic bonds, blended financing, etc., difficult to secure. This situation compels us to seek alternative financing options in order to ensure the continuous provision of public infrastructure projects, which are essential for our country's development goals. So in the meantime, the 2024 budget speech emphasized on accelerating PPPs to secure investments and expertise for public infrastructure projects. So let's take a look at what a PPP means. According to the World Bank's Public-Private Partnership Monitor, PPPs refer to the collaboration between the government and the private sector to share responsibilities, risks, resources, and expertise in the provision of services. PPPs are not a new concept to Sri Lanka. From 1990 to 2017, Sri Lanka entered 81 PPP projects worth $2,671 million, primarily in energy, ports, and ICT sectors. For For example, the groundbreaking success of South Asia Gateway's terminus that's located at the Port of Colombo is a testament to this. Yet, despite being a pioneer of PPPs in South Asia, stakeholders have revealed that Sri Lanka's current PPP framework is impeded by multiple institutional and regulatory weaknesses. Key findings that are mentioned in our policy brief include a lack of a clear implementation and legal framework for PPPs, a lack of technical capacity among institutions that facilitate or execute PPPs, and a lack of transparency and credibility among institutions facilitating and executing PPPs. So let's take a look at our first finding, which is a lack of a clear implementation and legal framework for PPPs. Under this, we have outlined that there is a weak compliance with the country's existing project prioritization framework, which is the Public Investment Program. The Public Investment Program, or PIP, is a rolling 4-year public investment prepared by the Department of National Planning that decides which public infrastructure projects, including PPPs, are to be implemented in Sri Lanka. Although the current PIP for 2020 to 2024 has been prepared, most approved and implemented infrastructure projects, which also includes PPPs, do not comply with this program. Next, there's also no central authority that has the legal mandate to oversee PPPs in Sri Lanka. While we do have the National Agency for Public-Private Partnerships, also known as the NAPPP, it currently lacks the expertise and capacity to function as an oversight body for PPPs and instead acts as an advisory board for PPP projects. Moreover, there is yet no approved PPP law in the country at present, and right now the 1998 guidelines serve to guide the procurement and execution of PPP projects. However, these guidelines are not legally binding and lack details on many important issues. For example, the guidelines do not address land rights, restriction on foreign investor participation, environmental and social issues, dispute resolution, enforcement mechanism, or termination and compensation, and also it's silent on state-owned enterprise involvement in PPP projects. However, there's a new PPP bill that is reportedly in the works to address the above issues. So weaknesses in the legal framework have led to discretionary decisions during tendering and contract signing. And ultimately, these weaknesses could deter attracting potential investors who prefer the stability and certainty that comes with dedicated laws and regulations in our country. So next, our second key finding is the lack of technical capacity among institutions that facilitate or execute PPPs. This can be seen within the agency entrusted in handling PPP projects, which I mentioned before, which is the National Agency for PPPs. So just a little bit of context to the NAPPP. The NAPPP was established in July 2017 with World Bank support as a specialized division of the Ministry of Finance. And in March 2020, its operations were abruptly terminated via an ad hoc decision. The NAPPP was later reinstated back in 2022, but as I mentioned before, it still lacks the technical expertise and currently functions as that of an advisory board. Secondly, there's also a lack of technical capacity among the relevant line ministries involved in implementing these PPP projects, and this has led to ad hoc decision making. For example, PPPs are misunderstood by public authorities to be free gifts, when in reality they involve substantial fiscal risk to the government, which would involve contingent liabilities and maybe even upfront costs. So in consequence, this lack in institutional capacity has also impacted the visibility and accountability in how PPPs are procured and managed. So this leads me to our third key finding, which is the lack of transparency and credibility among institutions facilitating and executing PPPs. So this can be seen in the implementation of public infrastructure projects for PPPs, which often tend to be largely based on political considerations. For example, if you take the government recently entered a PPP with an Indian and Russian firm to manage the Matale International Airport that's in Hambantota. So there's no publicly available information on whether there was a competitive and fair bidding process involved for this particular PPP. And my second point is that there is currently a lack of transparency in providing up-to-date details in relation to the procurement and execution of ongoing and past PPP projects. There's even research out there that highlights that even filing RTIs is very difficult to obtain information, especially with regards to SOE involvement in PPP projects. So ultimately, the transparency in PPP procurement and execution undermines the credibility of institutions and also the country as a whole. This can signal to potential investors that the procurement is not fair and that the investment climate that the procurement is not competitive and that the investment climate is not fair. So in terms of these existing challenges in the PPP landscape, we at the Advocata Institute, jointly with ASI, have proposed reforms in 3 key areas. The first being legal and regulatory reforms. Under this, we have outlined that the approval of the upcoming PPP Act should be accelerated, and also weaknesses in bidding and procurement practices should be addressed. For example, especially when you take into consideration the issues that come about with unsolicited proposals. Also, the dedicated national PPP unit, which is the NAPPP, should be provided with a legal mandate. And the NAPPP and the relevant line ministries should be legally empowered to conduct pre-feasibility and feasibility studies. They should be able to produce clear statements of anticipated contingent liabilities and costs, which should be approved by the Ministry of Finance. And also these costs should be reflected in the annual budget throughout the PPP contract's duration. And lastly, the public investment program should be published online to facilitate efficient allocation of private investments for priority projects. The second reform is to do with capacity building. Under this, we have outlined that the NAPPP should be empowered with the necessary budgetary provisions to recruit skilled personnel who have a background in project financing, engineering, finance, banking, and law. And also budgetary provisions of access to multilateral grants to operationalize PPPs should be ensured. Also, PPP units should be established within the relevant line ministries, and they should also be empowered to hire skilled professionals. And our final reform is to do with improving the investment environment for PPPs. Under this, we have outlined that the government should initially focus on transferring existing government assets for private operation and management. And thereafter, new PPP projects should be pursued following post-debt restructuring in our country and after improved investor confidence. And also the government should implement measures that will help reduce the cost of investments in order to attract private investments to public infrastructure projects. So, however, realistically speaking, PPPs are complex and the political climate can significantly influence the direction of PPP projects in terms of its feasibility and success. These political moments are fleeting. They present narrow windows during which ambitious projects like PPPs can be realized. Therefore, perfecting every aspect of a PPP agreement is not tenable, and it could ultimately result in missed opportunities. So a delicate balance must be struck between crafting comprehensive agreements and capitalizing on the right political moment. Achieving this balance necessitates pragmatism and adaptability on the government's end. Striking this balance can ensure that stakeholders maximize the potential of PPPs to deliver value to both the public and private sectors, advancing shared goals of economic growth and societal development. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. Please make sure to read up on our policy brief, which will be uploaded shortly. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Nirmali, for that very informative presentation. So The next item on our agenda is our panel discussion. I'm sure a lot of you are waiting to hear what our three experts have to say about the current PPP landscape. So we have a distinguished panel of experts who will basically delve deeper into this topic. So let me just move into introducing them and giving you a little bit of context about their backgrounds as well. So we have, please welcome our panelists, two of whom are actually very familiar to the Advocata Institute, Mr. Thilan Wijesinghe, Professor Rohan Samarajiva, and Mr. Umair Ismail. So Mr. Thilan is currently the chairman of the CEO and CEO of TWCorp Private Limited, and is also the former chairman of the National Agency for Public-Private Partnerships within the Ministry of Finance. So he is widely credited as the pioneer in public-private partnerships transactions in Sri Lanka, with over 26 years of experience in financially closing PPP transactions that are too many to count in Sri Lanka. His work also extends to other countries such as Bangladesh, Maldives, Nepal, etc. Professor Samarajiva is the founding chair of Lirneasia, an ICT policy and regulation think tank in Sri Lanka. He is also an advisor to the Advocata Institute. Professor Samarajiva has a wealth of experience in public policy and regulatory matters, serving as the chair of the ICT agency, the apex body for information and communication technology with the government of Sri Lanka in 2018 and 2019. He was also the team leader at Sri Lanka Ministry of Economic Reform, Science and Technology between 2002 and 2004. And he was responsible for infrastructure reforms among many other positions. Mr. Umair Ismail currently serves as a consultant with the Ministry of Power and Energy and is a co-member of the Power Sector Reform Secretariat, where he plays a central role in the restructuring of the CEV. He has over 14 years of global experience in asset management, transaction advisory, PPP structuring, and investment strategy. And previously, Mr. Umair served as the lead transaction advisor at the National Agency for Public-Private Partnerships. So welcome to you all. I hope you're doing okay and joining and things like that was not too bad and you're not facing any technical difficulties.
Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So, let's not delay everybody any further. Let's jump straight into the discussion, right? So let me actually start off with Mr. Thilan. So my question to you actually is, you must have listened to our presentation, and in our presentation, we've highlighted or more, so our policy brief basically highlights the existing problems from more of a macro perspective of the PPP landscape in Sri Lanka, and also some recommendations to overcome them, right? So as someone who has headed the National Agency for Public-Private Partnerships in the past, what are some of the key ingredients of PPPs that Sri Lanka has to get right now, or prioritize getting right in the current political climate for Sri Lanka to be able to maximize PPPs?
Yes. PPPs are best procured when they're competitively bid out. One of the key objectives that we followed in the late 90s was not to accept even one unsolicited proposal. And that's the basis on which we financially closed about $800 million of transactions between 1996 and 2001. Even the SAGT project was competitively solicited, even though we had very few bidders because of the country being in war situation. Typically, power projects attracted 6 to 8 bidders ranging from Europe to Japan. At that time, China was not a major investor at all. Now, we've seen over the years a greater propensity to entertain unsolicited proposals, and there has been gradually a reduction of investor interest from a global perspective in our PPP environment, because primarily due to poor documentation and poor processes. And yes, and also because of corruption. Particularly in the power sector, we have seen the domination of a state-owned entity, and a reduction gradually over the years of the number of bidders who participate in power sector solicitations. In fact, the recently concluded 50 megawatt wind energy project did not attract even one single foreign bidder. And that is a tragedy. So therefore, if I were to answer the question in what do we need to do in the current political environment, Sri Lanka does not have the wiggle room to borrow and spend any further. We have to be very, very judicious in identifying and screening projects, whether it's public investment or private investment via PPPs. And that's why I'm very much bullish on the Public Finance Management Act being passed through Parliament, because that clearly sets a framework of identifying public investment projects via a public investment committee and deciding what is the best method of financing that. A situation where I saw in your presentation that there should be PPP units in government ministries. I would call them PPP cells, but they should necessarily be accountable to a central PPP authority. And there is no better place to locate a PPP authority than the Ministry of Finance, because it is the Ministry of Finance, chaired by a Secretary of the Treasury, that decides on which project should be accepted or screened in the context of the country's priorities. So therefore, in my assessment, in a situation where Sri Lanka has considerable fiscal constraints, one has to exert, as you rightly pointed out in your proposal, an estimate of any contingent liability that arises from PPP projects as well. In fact, recently I was quite surprised to see a newspaper article to say some of the unfinished highway projects, that there's a plan to complete them via public-private partnership structures. Now, one has to understand that every time you look at a highway project as a PPP, there is a massive gap between the revenue that can be collected and the cost of those. If you were to look at the Katunayaka Highway project, and the debt service costs the government is incurring, the tolls cover only about a third, and that is not counting profit margin if a private party is to invest. So there are massive contingent liabilities that arise from these. So in an era of where we require greater fiscal prudence, in my assessment, my recommendation is, yes, we need a PPP law, but a mere existence of a PPP law does not necessarily mean we'll procure PPPs efficiently. Case in point is Bangladesh. They have a fantastic law, but they have one of the lowest success rates of PPPs even compared to Sri Lanka. Because what matters is what goes in the regulations. What matters is the process. What the PPP law says is that, yes, we must have these minimum qualifications and the government agencies must support, and that's what goes into the law. But it's ultimately the ability of that team that huddles around in a project committee, or what is called a cabinet appointed negotiating committee, to negotiate the best possible deal through multidisciplinary teams that gives you the most value for money in terms of transactions. One final comment. I don't want to talk too much, but since it will be difficult to ramp up, I mean, there's no question in my mind that the PPP agency must be in a position to pay something close to market rates. That's what happened in the late 90s. About 25 of us, all of whom from the private sector, we were all in our 20s and 30s at the time, joined government on salaries that were somewhat close to what was paid in the market, because that team complemented the government's technical skills by bringing into government financial and legal structuring skills. And the other way of ramping up capability in PPPs is to judiciously procure transaction advisors who can bring that knowledge. So you can have a central PPP unit that might not necessarily have all of the skills. You can get donor funding, and through that funding, you hire your experts through technical assistance, grant funding, or various other types of funding, or you appoint transaction advisors. And of course, these transaction advisors charge fees, and they obviously need to be the right type of transaction advisor. So that's in a summary what I feel is important for Sri Lanka to maximize the PPP potential in the future.
All right, thank you, Mr. Thilan. So Mr. Thilan basically told us about, what we really need to get right for our future PPP projects, right? So Mr. Umair, for you, I have a question. So basically last year, the government awarded a contract for an integrated renewable energy project in Siambalandur through a competitive bidding process, right? So it's said to be the first of its kind in accelerating Sri Lanka's efforts to boost renewable energy generation. Could you share some insights into what you think was quite unique about that project? What went right? Why was it considered successful? And if we should maybe replicate similar projects in the future?
Sure, no, thank you, Yasmin. And again, thank you for having me. I can't speak specifically for Siambalandur because I was not very much involved in it, but I think what matters is getting to the model of the perfect type of power procurement project, right? So obviously going competitive is just one step, but there have been challenges that have been faced by a lot of these power generators that has, somewhat been resolved, I believe, through this. And we will see once the project gets implemented, how successful it is. But if you take, for example, a very simple thing is the land. So the land was automatically secured in this project, which is a huge challenge. Otherwise, if you try to go and do it on yourself. And then even the land lease was all identified and was going to be signed only upon the successful award happening. So this gives the bidders a degree of comfort that, the land is secured, which has been a bottleneck in the past. The same way, the EIA was concluded as well. So this is another step, usually, the generators will have to do on their own. In this case, it was already done, and the payment for it could have been done, could be done once it's been awarded. So that's, again, you take one layer out of this very complex transactions. Another very important thing is, at the time we were talking about this procurement, Sri Lanka obviously had some economic challenges, right? So how do you overcome this? Because we didn't have enough US dollars in the country. So I thought it was very progressive that they thought about, giving USD tariffs for these projects, because if not, how do you really make it bankable given the context of the country at that time? Then one of the other challenges, we keep hearing different challenges, and one of these challenges are around transmission or capacity for transmission. So one thing that this procurement did was they allowed for a private company to come in and do an EPC transmission. Now, we've taken this further actually in the new Electricity Act. The new Electricity Act actually allows transmission to be owned by private companies, whereby, you could even take it to, you can even do PPPs on the transmission line itself, which can further bring in, credible parties and make the cost come down. But in this instance, it was a very important bottleneck because CEB has its own, debt. But just because the transmission ended up with the private company, it doesn't necessarily mean that the CEB had to take a step away. So risk mitigation, whereby the transmission lines, so the corridors, were still the purview or the responsibility of the CEB. So these type of mechanisms, when you embed them together, comes very close to what we call a model PPP, right? When it comes to the energy generation side, because otherwise you end up having a project that is just procured based on capacity, and then everyone scrambles to find land, they scramble to do all the other things, and we don't really get apples to apples comparison. So I hope that I answered your question, Yasmin.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Umair. So, Mr. Umair, like in your response, like I think you highlighted the importance of creating the necessary conditions or preconditions to attract, bidders to actually, even submit their proposals for projects and things like that, right? So I want to ask a question from Mr. Rohan, Professor Rohan, about basically, I remember seeing a recent article that was written by you about how basically there should be a balance to be achieved between understanding the importance of getting private investments and understanding the necessary conditions for inducing private investments. So how can governments actually balance the need for regulation in PPPs with the flexibility required for innovative private sector participation?
Thank you. I think Thilan referred to the sort of the golden age of infrastructure reforms in Sri Lanka when he was head of the BOI, the Board of Investment, and he set up the Bureau of Infrastructure Investment, which was responsible for the SAGT. Now, I mean, when we lived through that period, we didn't think it was a golden age. We thought it was tough times. We thought there was a war going on and bombs were going off in Colombo. But in actual fact, there were two elements. That is the international environment in terms of people wanting to invest in the emerging economies was way better than today, in my opinion. And maybe Thilan and I might disagree on this. My example comes from the telecom sector, where the kind of mad, giddy excitement that they had back in the 90s, before the bubble burst in 2001, is definitely no longer there. And my other example is water, which is sort of one of the more boring, but one of the most important infrastructure areas, that is water and sewerage. There were companies that were willing to come in on PPPs on water those days. Now I think that market is basically gone. We can talk PPPs, but we'll be lucky to find one bidder. Quite a few of those guys have basically pulled out of that activity. So that is the external factor. Internally, I think we were, you could say we had not demonstrable failures of government trustworthiness, government keeping its word and so on. Wasn't there. I mean, we were, in a way, there was a certain innocence about the government. But now, we reversed transactions. We've taken back Sri Lankan Airlines after we gave it to them for frivolous reasons, gave it to a private investor to manage for frivolous reasons. Even the SLT management contract we pulled back. I mean, there's a whole series of things that would cause an investor to think twice about looking at Sri Lanka. I haven't even got to the question that this is a country that is still in selective default, right? And that our sort of the overall country risk is much higher than it used to be. So what we have to understand is that when I listen to your presentation, I get a sense that this presentation could have been done in the 1990s. There's a assumption there that the world is knocking on our door, wanting to come and invest in Sri Lanka. The situation is that we have to go find people to come in. It's not, I mean, if you want to use the word seller's market and buyer's market, right? We are not in a position of strength in terms of bringing large investors in right now. So this is a country where, most of the economic models say there'll be 3% growth. There's maybe a 50-50 chance that we'll go back into default or into the IMF. So, I mean, there's a certain realism that is missing in a lot of the discussions that I hear. So it is in this environment where we have to look at these sort of ideal case scenarios, right? So what we have to do is understand our limitations. And while we would like to get away from the geopolitical factors and, to some extent, it may be geopolitics that will cause companies or countries to encourage companies to come in, because their calculus will not be a purely economic calculus. No, we don't like that, right? Nobody likes that. I don't like it. But to a certain extent, can we avoid it in the current circumstances? That is the balance that I'm trying to point to. So that particular article was not about a PPP, because it's a 100% government company, private investment. I don't think it satisfies the criteria of sharing responsibilities, sharing risks, sharing resources, sharing expertise, right? And I was talking about the proposed Adani investment in wind power in Manna. I don't think we are going to give any of those things, right? I think even the land they have negotiated on their own, right? So we have a situation where we call things PPPs in this country. Now, for example, I don't know, I mean, our favorite PPPs are in the port, right? The SAGT, CICT, and so on, and now even the Adani Kiel's terminal. But in all these cases, we're taking 15% of the profits because we say that the Port Authority has 15% of it. Then I suppose we take a lot of services, fees for various kinds of services, fire, towing, and so on and so forth. But when there's investment required, I don't think the Port Authority actually puts in money, right? So that whole issue of sharing risk requires them to, if there's an additional investment being made, they should put 15% of the money. Now, instead, what we've got is right at the outset, we're giving 15% for the land, I suppose, for giving the surface for X number of years, right? And for that, they'll collect 15% of the profits forever. I think, I mean, it might have been even cleaner to cut the Port Authority out and remove the tax exemptions on these people. All three of those terminals are 100% tax exempt, which I find, what's the word I should use? Appalling, unacceptable, makes me unhappy kind of condition, because you said taxes are easy to impose and implement, whereas dividends or profits can be, I think anybody who knows how companies are run can see how those numbers, how those calculations can be manipulated. I mean, you can get high numbers and 15% of a high number, or you can get 15% of a low number. So these are the kinds of issues that we need to think about. My sense is that, you see, another issue that we have to think about in terms of infrastructure is time. Time. So the information that I have is that Sri Lanka's electricity consumption has come back to the level it was before, say, third quarter of 2022, when the electricity subsidies were removed and the country was still in crisis. So now we are back to sort of, you could say, normal, right? Now, what does this mean? That if our economy is in positive growth and keeps going at 3%, or maybe with luck, 4.5%, 5% growth, we will need electricity. In 2 years, 3 years' time, we will need more electricity. And we can't wait till 2 or 3 years down the road to construct the ideal environment for electricity investments, because electricity generating capacity or even transmission facilities don't turn on a dime, right? So you can't decide in 2026 that you want these things, and you can't have your nice competitive process and get everybody at the table, have the assessment in a transparent manner, and then have the land acquisitions and all these things done properly, and then electricity. No, if you start it in 2026, you're going to see the electricity flowing in 2029 or 2030, if you're lucky. So that is my problem. if we don't have all the conditions, even if we don't have all the conditions, we have to go now with certain imperfections. Because otherwise, we'll not be paying high prices for wind power. We'll be paying through our nose for emergency fossil fuel-based power in 2028 and 2029. That is the choice that we have to make. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Professor Samarajiva. So, I mean, maybe we can come to what you said at the end a little bit later. Maybe we can give some chances for the other two panelists to maybe reflect thoughts. But anyway, let's move to basically Mr. Thilan. So something that Professor Samarajiva said about the importance of the government also contributing, having, creating, so, I mean, he brought up the example of the SAGT and all these ports, projects that happen, and how the government, all they did was give land, but still they have a 15% stake, right? So, I mean, let's come back to basically right now, right? So, the economic transformation bill that was just passed, right? So it talks about the establishment of these special investment zones. How do you think these zones can actually be leveraged to enhance the effectiveness of and also the attractiveness of PPPs?
Well, the economic transformation bill talks of attracting private investment into special economic zones. Just to delve 2 minutes into history, if you go back to the late 70s when Katunayaka Biyagama, and then during my tenure as BOI chairman, we built 8 zones. They were entirely publicly funded because at that time, because our industry was based on cost competitiveness, such as labor, primarily apparel and other exports that needed to be in a cost competitive country, the state took the burden of investing in these export processing zones and provided all of the infrastructure, power, water, sewerage at a cost, at market rates. And in fact, in water, it was a premium because the Board of Investment needed to recover capital. And then the land was allocated on what was considered to be, at that time, in my view, land allocation was somewhat subsidized. So they were cheaper than land that was going to be located outside the zones. And the thinking at that time was that manufacturing industry, some of them are polluting, such as textiles, needed to be in EPZs where the water treatment, effluent discharge, all these environmental issues are addressed in one location, because the moment you go outside the zone, you have a multitude of approvals that are needed. Now that model has succeeded, and all of these 13 or 14 zones of the BOI are pretty much full, right? Then you need to, my view is that element of what is history should not be touched, because it does not make sense to privatize something that's working well, right? Because then the element of private profit comes in, and there is not enough space anyway within those zones to attract new investment in terms of new sources of FDI. Then you have the case where somewhere again in the 90s, mid-90s, I believe, the DFCC Bank, along with some other partners, built what is called Lindell, Sri Lanka's first ever privately funded industrial zone, which was done with private investment, with feasibility studies, and that also became successful because that was the right location, right time to create such an enterprise, and they profited, charging market rates, notwithstanding there being the Biyagamas and the Katunayakas and Sitawaka zones. Now, coming back to the present day, the first question one must ask is, okay, if you are going to attract private investment into special economic zones, to what type of special economic zones? Has anyone looked at a pre-feasibility, which is a sine qua non, absolutely required prior to your, going out to market and attracting such investments? Now, if I may point out, back of envelope thinking at this moment, if you are to attract private investment into typical industry, export-oriented industrial zones, you may necessarily have to give the land away literally free, because the investor concerned has to build all the infrastructure inside the zone, internal roads, water, sewerage, power, etc. And the state may very well have to also put their dip into public funds to provide the access roads and any infrastructure to the periphery of the site. But all this has to be preceded by a proper feasibility study. Now, industrial zones are not the only type of EPs investment zones that one can create. We can look at agriculture zones. With the entire value chain of cold storage, transport, cultivation, etc. Within that, under a special economic zone law, the idea of a special economic zone law is to provide ease of doing business. Just to give you an example, Yasmin, the fastest time, I believe this is a record, of an investor submitting a BOI application and commencing commercial operations, that means raising his first sales invoice, was 3 weeks. That is because the investor came on day one, got his approval, signed his agreement, went into one of the zones where there was a vacant factory, signed a lease agreement, opened his LCs, and started commercial operation, all in 3 weeks. That's what a special economic zone should be able to do, right? So that is a raison d'etre, or the reason why we need these sorts of areas. So one needs to look at, do we need tourism special economic zones, such as in a location such as Trincomalee? What is the Air Force doing running a golf course? That should be part of a and of course the airport in Trincomalee, part of an overall tourism, energy, real estate development enterprise, and port, of course, eventually in the Trincomalee area. So this requires not just a master plan, which is, I'm sure, has been done. It requires rigorous analysis. What is the way in which we prioritize? Take, for example, Port City, right? Port City was intended to become a special economic zone that was purely predicated on ease of doing business. When I was involved in a committee chaired under the Yapalna government in charge of policy, the idea of the Port City law was not to create a financial sector. It was to create a special economic zone law that would be benchmarked on top 20 ease of doing business. How quickly can you open a company? How quickly can you get all your visas? How quickly can people move here, move their goods, and get going? It was intended to be plug and play, so that while the rest of the country is languishing on a number 100 or 90 in terms of ease of doing business, the Port City location would be top 20. So my answer to your question was, yes, it's not fundamentally a bad thing to have a law that would encourage special economic zones with private investment. However, there's a lot more rigorous analysis that needs to be carried out in order to make such PPPs feasible. And the best way to do that is look at a bit of the history. What has gone right? What has gone wrong? As far as I can tell you, Port City current law has got it wrong. It needs amendments. It needs new regulations. So it has not worked. So let's go back to the drawing board and see what learnings are possible. And then look at different types of SEZs, whether it's tourism, agriculture, ports and logistics. I mean, that in itself can be, for example, I'm surprised that to this date, Hambantota is not a special economic zone where we have logistics-based industries and port-related industries coming in their rows. We only have at the moment a ro-ro business in the port of Hambantota. So that's my 2 cents worth on that subject, Yasmin.
All right, thanks, Mr. Thilan. So, I mean, you spoke a little bit about like how there needs to be conditions in place for like private investors to even want to invest in a particular region or zone, right? That's what your response was actually saying to us. So I think my question to Mr. Umair was really about, in your view, Mr. Umair, what are the most critical factors that influence the bankability of PPP projects? Mr. Thilan spoke about like how the importance of, if you want to make zones attractive to private investments, what needs to be done or what's missing in them. But in terms of PPP projects, what do you think are the most critical factors, and how can these be effectively communicated to potential investors?
Sure, no, thanks. I think we sometimes forget that when you want to successfully conclude a PPP transaction, it is not just the public and the private, but it's also the financial, right? So there is a bank or a DFI or somewhere there that's actually planning on giving the debt financing that is going to be essential to close a transaction, right? So if you do not have the basic building blocks, you might get two participants to come on board, but you might not actually get financial closure, right? So if you, firstly, I mean, we spoke about this already, I think the regulatory framework. So you need to have clear laws governing it and stable policies and the political commitment. I think that is very key. And I think Professor Samarajiva also alluded to that very clearly. You know, we cannot go back on transaction that just doesn't send the right signal. Then the next thing is risk allocation, right? So how do you make something bankable, right? Clear risk allocation between the public sector and the private sector is key. So not just allocating the risk, but then once the risk is with the public sector, you need to produce methods to mitigate the risks as well. So what are the government guarantees that are being provided? Is insurance being provided? Is there a contingency plans? Can we get donor guarantees in place? Because they are available and we never touch these options at all. So we need to really look at, okay, what are the risk allocations? Then very important is financial viability. You know, we go through projects as if every single project can be done as a PPP, which it can't, right? So how much are we doing? Are we doing sound financial projections upfront? And if we are not, then, you know, we're never going to go ahead, do a bankable project. So I'll give you a very simple example. I mean, I think Thilan brought up Port City. And at that time, we were looking at doing a convention center as a PPP. Now, debatable if a convention center needs to be done or not. But if you just look at it from just a surface level, the government of Sri Lanka wanted market rates on the land for a convention center. But if you just plug that into a financial model, you can very clearly see the IRR is not sufficient. So there is a disconnect between what the government wants and what is actually possible in a private setting. So there has to be revenue guarantees if you are going into projects that the demand is unknown for. This is very normal and there's no choice, but you have to do it because that's how you're going to reduce the overall cost. And then obviously VGFs and subsidies, these things have to be very well thought out. Otherwise, you're not going to make the project bankable. Another component which we sometimes think it comes automatically, which is the technical feasibility, right? We do not want to go into projects that have unproven technology or unproven business models, because banks are not going to accept that. You know, people might think even in a what would you call it, unsolicited basis, they might come up with these interesting ideas, but the reality is we are not going to see the light of day and we're just going to waste a lot of time actually running behind them. So having experienced partners and having known technology, these things really reduce the burden on delivery. Then I think stakeholder engagement, we need to be more transparent upfront, right? So I think we spoke about water PPPs. I think Thilan knows this very well. We did a Velivita bulk water supply project and we had multiple bids that actually came in. And this went through the official channel, and I think it was very successful. But then I think it fell apart during, you know, the union discussions and the area. There was a land issue there. So again, we did not do the prep sufficiently, even though the transaction advisor was considered extremely, you know, highly qualified, right? So I think we need to really look at all these attributes. And I think one final thing, maybe the environmental and social. PPP projects are long-term projects and it has impact on the environment, can have impact on social, especially if you're doing, let's say, highway. You have to, you know, move people from their homes. How are you really addressing this? What is the addressing mechanism, right? If you do not have these mechanisms in place, what is the probability of actually getting to closure? It is very, very limited. So I think, you know, these are some of the areas which we have to really build up, and we can get into more details on how to do it. So, you know, let's talk about simple communication. I think that was one of your questions. Yasmin, it was that, you know, how do we communicate to the bidders, right? So how much of this is done in a detailed project documentation, right? Do we have our feasibility studies, the financial risk assessments? Are we actually doing all this upfront and making that available so that we can attract foreign bidders to come into the market? Yes, we want to move fast, but we also want to move smart. Because if you just only plan on moving fast, I think you're just going to prolongate the eventual, which is this not happening. We do not even do a risk allocation matrix, to be very honest. I mean, I was in the PPP agency. How much of our projects were done through a risk allocation matrix and highlighting the measures to mitigate risks? I don't think we really gave a lot of thought to this. And none of the agencies have the capacity to actually think through these projects. We do not do sensitivity analysis when it comes to understanding, are these projects viable or not? I mean, we can think of, okay, at this rate, this project is viable, but what happens when you start putting in sensitivity analysis? Does this project become viable at that point? And those are the metrics that the banks are going to really look at. And then, I think those are some of the key things. And obviously having engagement plans with stakeholders, having ideas on how to mitigate environmental risks. These are all things that are going to play a part in eventually closing a transaction and making them more bankable. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Umair. So I think your answer really highlighted, if you want to even get someone to bid for a project and actually reach financial close with an investor, what actually the government needs to work on, right? But, let's say someone or an investor and the government do, basically agree to a PPP and a project achieves not financial close, but basically there's a contract that comes into place, right? What about the operation and maintenance basically of these PPPs? So I'm basically going to direct my next question to Professor Samarajiva, which is because you've had a lot of experience, right, in regulatory bodies. So what mechanisms can actually be put in place to ensure the long-term maintenance and operational efficiency of PPPs or infrastructure that is developed through PPPs? For example, how do you make sure that both the public entity as well as the private entity holds their end of the bargain throughout the contract? And how can you handle disputes between them? So could you maybe give us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. Now, you see, the essence of a PPP is that it's being run by people with skin in the game. Unlike state-owned enterprises, where, the people who are running the state-owned enterprises don't have any of their money at stake. In a private investment or in a PPP, the people, if the company does not perform, who's going to take the hit, right? It's going to be the investors. That's what the word risk, I think in your definition, it says shares, responsibilities, risks, right? So the heart of it is in those two words, right? So I think there is a great need for the government to set up parliamentary committees and God knows what to try to get some degree of responsibility attached to the people who run state-owned enterprises. I don't think the same is necessary for PPPs, because if a PPP fails, the people who are going to pay for that failure will take corrective measures unless they're crazy, right? Unless they're willing to sacrifice their investment. So then what remains? So the regulator's job is not to become a micromanager looking over the shoulder of a company to see whether they are maintaining their equipment properly, etc., etc. What is required is the other matter that you mentioned, which is how do you resolve conflicts? How do you resolve disputes? Now, when you look at disputes, you can have disputes between the partners, right? And if you just, well, you can do that. Then you can have disputes between the PPP entity and the general public or significant other stakeholders, right? So they would not have money at stake, but they would be dependent on the PPP as a buyer or a seller of services or something like that, right? Now, I think I go back to what Umair said. Now, both these things can pose risks. So then you look at those risks and you see how are you going to manage them. And they're not necessarily that there's a single solution to manage all the risks with regard to these two kinds of disputes, right? So now I'll prefer to talk with examples. Now, what had happened with, say, let's take the example of the Sri Lanka telecom privatization back in 1997. The entire telecom market was completely crazy, distorted, in the sense that domestic calls yielded only, I would say, about 35% of the total revenues of the company. Most of the revenue came from international, and it was well known that the international prices, the Americans were sick of paying exorbitant termination charges. They were going to push that down. That was just a matter of time when the international revenues would go down. And then technological bypass was happening. I don't think anybody pays high rates for international calls nowadays. And the other thing was that if you had that distorted environment, there was no incentive for the company to go out and connect more people who were more likely to be making only domestic calls. The incentive was to go and connect only people who make international calls or receive international calls. It was completely unviable situation. Now, there were agreements that the government had entered into with the investor, who got only 35% of the ownership of the company, that the government would remedy this over a period of 5 years. And the government appointed a regulator to manage what is technically called a rate rebalancing, right? Because of cross subsidies, the domestic prices were very low, international prices were very high, and the regulator had a legal obligation to fix this problem. Now, having been the regulator who did this, I can tell you that there were enormous pressures on me to not do it, because the middle class in Sri Lanka is always whining and moaning and wanting cheap everything. So they say, we want cheap telephone calls. We don't, I mean, that's what they want. They don't say what they don't want, but that's what they want. But we did it. We bit the bullet and we got those prices back where they should be. And we now have no waiting lists and pretty much everybody has telephony and so on and so forth, right? So that was a risk that if that rate rebalancing was not done, there would be a problem, and the government committed to get it done. Now, was that commitment strong enough? Was it ironclad? If we had a weaker regulator, maybe that would not have been delivered. I can't tell. I think it should be, these things should be more, I mean, but there were provisions, for example, for them to go to arbitration if they didn't get what they had been promised, right? So one of the issues that we have seen with some of these PPPs, for example, in Philippines, where Manila water was supposed to be, there were certain things the government had to do, the government didn't, and the private investor went in for arbitration. Now, I think many people would know that international arbitration is a very extraordinarily expensive and painful process, which has many negatives. So for those kinds of things where legal agreements have to be interpreted and disputes resolved, my recommendation generally has been that the regulator, independent regulator, with the adequate capacity and the ability to bring in specialized dispute resolution experts, should be in place with the sort of the first line of authority. You can have international arbitration in the back, but that this should be the sort of the first remedy that you can get. Now, we had such things, and one of the important things that I had, one of the advantages I had in the Telecom Regulatory Commission at the time, was that I was able to get world-class dispute resolution experts to try to tamp down some of the problems in the telecom sector, right? Whether that is always possible in the context of current government and public expectations, where for the littlest thing, some newspaper or some MP will start running around saying, oh my God, these people are being paid millions, right? But the real legal experts, what I found, interestingly, is that the most expensive people that I work with in my role as a regulator and in my role as a policy implementer in the Ministry for Economic Reforms, the most expensive people were the lawyers. And I got to say, I was kind of shocked by how much they were charging. But on the other hand, when I had to work with some lawyers who were not so competent, and I had to sort of basically get rid of them, I realized I appreciated the value of good legal expertise. So I think we really need to understand that all these things, you can theoretically talk about dispute resolution, etc., but you need to have the resources to actually get those things done. Just giving some incompetent and ill-resourced organization dispute resolution authority isn't going to do the job. I'll stop.
Thank you, Professor Samarajiva. So, I mean, we have about 20 minutes more to go. So maybe we'll switch to the Q&A session. I just want to state before I start with the first question to those on the Zoom call or watching us live, please feel free to add in any questions that you might have in the chat box. If you all are on Zoom, if you all are watching us live, in the comments section, we will take as many as we can and try to get them answered. So actually, our first question today is directed to Mr. Thilan. In your opinion, what are the top 2 or 3 reasons that Port City is failing to attract investments?
Let me put it this way. I am a believer in the fact that expanding the Colombo Central Business District into the ocean, having gone through all the environment issues, etc., leaving that aside, and creating oceanfront real estate has significant potential for investment, because Colombo is the most livable city in South Asia. There's no question about it. I mean, I have met dozens of Indian, Bangladesh, Pakistani, and other CEOs who would, particularly from India, I would say, who would not love to have a second home, park a yacht in the marina, go to the international school that is master planned. I have spoken to people who organize conventions who said, look, if you build a proper convention hall here, there's none in India. We will bring the Mercedes-Benz and BMW or whatever the auto shows to Colombo, and you'll have hundreds of Indians coming here to enjoy that. There isn't a single properly structured marina in anywhere, any South Asian ocean city. So the entire positioning of Port City becoming, say, a satellite city to a Bangalore or a Tamil Nadu, where you can enjoy the ocean and clean air, it remains valid. Now, where we got it wrong is what is the process that we have to follow in attracting investment. Now, we had a window of opportunity when geopolitical forces were not that strong in putting in place a communication strategy, a law, and an enabling environment in order to provide confidence to those nations that are somewhat, shall I say, skeptical towards Chinese investments. And some, I'm not here playing the geopolitical game, but it is entirely in the messaging because the port city land belongs to the sovereign, to the state of Sri Lanka. China Hub, who was an investor, for them to obtain a return on their investment, they're given roughly 35% of what it close to 30, I think it's 38% of the total land mass for them to market and get their investment. A majority, the rest of the land are public spaces and land allocated to the government of Sri Lanka. So the government also needs to get a return from this because government provides all of the infrastructure to the periphery of the site, power, water, sewerage. Inside the site, it is Port City who would invest. Now, the opportunity for us to attract these investment should have been on the premise of livability, entertainment, ease of doing business. It was not necessarily about a financial center. Now, that is where I have a fundamental problem with the thinking of the government that got elected in 2019, where they threw away a perfectly good law that was done under the Yahapalana government and brought in this particular law, which wrote into the law that there were going to be X number of years of tax holidays. Now, top corporates in the world want to pay tax. Because of various regulations, with these FATF or anti-money laundering regulations, many corporates in the world, law-abiding corporates, want to come into jurisdictions where there are minimal taxes. Right. So the moment and the second point is the moment you disapply the Monetary Law Act and not have the central bank being a part of the creation of an offshore entity, immediately there are red flags. So today, if you ask any top international lawyer, please assess the Port City law, they would come with a whole host of red flags and says these need to be amended. Right. So in our opinion, we ourselves messed up. We lost timing opportunities. We had certain windows of opportunity to actually market it in the proper way. We had an opportunity of creating the sort of special economic zone and a commission that included people from various nationalities, not necessarily for the president to willy-nilly appoint whom he wants as commission members. The Port City Commission, by definition, needs to have a nominee of the central bank. It needs to have international board members. It needs to have Indian board members. It needs to be projected as a project of the country. So I'm sorry if I'm rambling, but so in order to get this right, we need to address the basics of having what I call a gold standard special economic zone law. And the current law that was introduced in 2020, even though it went before the Supreme Court, and that was on matters of constitutionality, falls way short of being the sort of law that would attract all nations unhesitating to say, yes, this is a law about ease of doing business and livability. And we can have our back-end offices, we can enjoy our shopping, we can park a boat, and we can get all the approvals, as I was mentioning earlier, on a plug-and-play basis. So let me stop there.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Thilan. So basically, we've had another question from Mr. Umair. What are the main challenges that you have encountered in the financial structuring of PPP projects in the power and energy sector? And how have you addressed these challenges to ensure project viability and sustainability?
Oh, thank you, Yasmin. So personally, right now, since I've been with the Power Ministry, I've been primarily focused on the restructuring. So I haven't really worked per se on the energy projects that have come in. But I think I had made it during my the individual talk I gave a little earlier. I think I had made it very clear that when we go through, and I've been speaking to some of the stakeholders that are actually going through this process, and we are looking at it internally as well, because we are looking at a new procurement law, guidelines for energy, which is, a part of the new act as well. And it's very clear, like one of the main criterias are the lack of ability to have a model that can be easily plug and play. Right. So I understand, I think, that if you go about it stating that, some of these things could take time to do, I agree. It will take time. But the reality is, if you do not try to get closer to the model I spoke about, where, the land is secure, where you have proper transmission plan in place, where you have the right risk sharing mechanisms in place, where you're really never going to end up going for competitive procurement and actually getting international participants to come and bid. I mean, you spoke about Siamalandu. I mean, Siamalandu went to a local consortia, right? We did not get foreign bids for this. So how do we attract foreign investors? Because our demand, our need, I think Professor Samarajiva very clearly articulated this, right? We want to get, I think, close to around 2 gigawatts of power over the next 5 to 8 years. Now, if we want to get that power, I do not think we have the sufficient financing within our country to get there. The only way we are going to get there is through foreign investments. And right now, no one is interested in investing in Sri Lanka as foreigners. And that is predominantly because of some of the factors I highlighted. So unless we get that corrected, or we find someone like the World Bank that can give us their guarantees and get us started, because there are processes to actually get some guaranteeing from them, where they provide you LC facilities for up to a year, or they can give you loan guarantees. These are options that are available that we are not really tapping into. Unless we have the proper project structure and we have some degree of ability for the government to pay back and to make sure that these PPAs are going to be honored, we are really not going to get that FDIs, and we're never going to hit those targets that we need to.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Umair. Professor Rohan, so we have a question for you. How do you see the role of PPPs evolving in the next decade, particularly in the context of global economic uncertainties and the push for sustainable development?
Well, that's a pretty broad question. When I think about that, maybe I'll just add a little to what Umair said on the question that he was given. One is, of course, I think we really need in the energy sector to get our heads down and create this sort of ideal environments where we have the land acquisition, the transmission capacity, the environmental clearances all done, so that we can actually bid out for solar or wind power. We can bid it out in a competitive manner that fits all the criteria that are set out in your report. But I think we have to run on 2 different tracks. While that is being done, I think Umair is very, very clear on that, because we don't have any foreign investors willing to invest in this country in our current circumstances, other than the one that is now being the subject of massive controversy, right? So I think we need to go with those that we have, negotiate properly, if necessary, renegotiate prices, whatever. But don't stop those processes while you work on the other one. So run the 2 processes in parallel, because otherwise we'll be paying through our nose for diesel, fuel oil-based generation in 2 years' time. Now, the question that was asked was sustainability, right? How do we use, how will PPPs evolve in the future, right? Now, you know, a lot of people, when they talk about sustainability, I mean, in my view, I think the key to Sri Lanka's greatest contribution to sustainability would be to make everything electric, make every single thing electric, and make the electric, that is, I'm talking about buses, cars, three-wheelers, everything, factories. In my view, if you can make everything run on electricity, and then if we can have the electricity, well, our stated target is 70%, but I mean, I'm sure we can even go above that, given how much hydro we have in this country. Get as much of that as possible from renewables. We are doing our bit for renewable, for sustainable development, right? Now, the question is that people think that solar is free. After all, it's, I mean, the sun that just keeps coming down on us, right? And they think that wind, my God, the wind is blowing, it's free. That is not true. You have to make very significant investments. And even though prices have been coming down significantly, even now, wind is more expensive than solar. And solar is not as cheap as people think it is. Did I get muted? Okay.
Yeah, now we can hear you.
You have to have a rather significant upfront investment. And again, if you really think it through, again, referring to what Umair said, most of the inputs that are needed for wind have to be sourced from abroad. I mean, including even the cranes that will lift the towers and the turbines, right? If you look at solar, India doesn't like buying solar photovoltaic cells from China, but it's very, very difficult. They've got, I mean, they have great difficulty competing with the Chinese. So if you're talking low cost, you're talking Chinese photovoltaic cells, right? That has to be paid for in dollars, right? Up front. And there's only two ways of getting that. I mean, leaving out our tax money, which we don't have. So that's why we need private investment here. We need PPPs. And in the PPPs that we have, they have to be able to get the right return on the equity that they put in. And they have to be able to get the debt financing that they need. Even a massive company like Adani will tap the banks to do a 500 million or whatever number investment that they are planning, right? So there has to be a return on that. Now, the difficulty in our country is that every time you hear the word return on investment, half the country goes nuts, saying, oh, no, this is energy, we don't need a return on investment. Well, you don't need a return on investment. You're not going to get energy. It's as simple as that, right? So I think for sustainability, yes, we have to do renewables. We have to do, we have put more and more of our efforts into wind and solar. These are two resources that we are blessed with. The potential is enormous. But in order to do that, we have to recognize that we need investment and that we need to give the investors a proper return on their investment. Now, we can go beyond that. Now, we can go into public transport. I would say that's quite important for people who care about sustainable development. And what are the PPPs that we have in public transport? we have a railway system that is basically falling apart. I mean, I'm willing to put money on the table, take bets with people about the fact that there will be a bridge collapse in the next 2 years. A railway bridge collapse in the next 2 years. I'm willing to take a bet. But these bridges are all more than 100 years old, right? And people don't notice that even that relatively visible bridge that is off Navammavata, not Navammavata, Periharamavata or Navammavata or whatever, that thing was beginning to fall down, right? And they have just patched it up. Now, you don't have public-private investment in railways. I'm afraid we are not going to have a railway system after some time, right? Now, these are the things that we need to do, right? All over the world, we have to do this. And particularly in this country, where we have a wonderful asset, but that asset is sort of degrading by the day. So we do need PPPs there, and I don't even know how to do it without PPPs, right? That one is, I think, impossible. I don't think the government has anywhere near the resources that it has to get the track up to the levels that it needs to, particularly on the UA line or the upcountry line and so on, right? Those are all below international standards that we are running them. I think the speed limit on some of the track is about 15 kilometers, which is a joke. So I could go on. Yeah, we need PPPs if we are to do sustainability.
Thanks, Professor Samarajiva. We'll just take one last question. I think I will allow either Mr. Umair or Mr. Thilan to answer this. So despite the success of port sector PPPs, why is the government persisting with trying to do the East Terminal with government funding, spending over USD 600 million in the current economic scenario without engaging private sector investments?
I think, Thilan, you're better suited to answer this.
I'm not sure if Mr. Thilan is still on the call. He's not. No. Okay, fine. Mr. Umair, would you want to answer that? If that's okay.
Actually, the answer is I don't know. I think we have shown that we have the capability. I think there was another question in one of these chats that said, can you do knowledge transfers through PPPs? I mean, it's very evident that, for example, someone like John Keels has learned tremendous amount when it comes to ports, how to do ports. And SAGT is a prime example of that. And they could actually do another port as well. And if you look at, I think, the metrics on how much volumes that the private ports are actually carrying compared to the government port, it is very evident that there are levels of inefficiencies within the port, the government managed port, which is not conducive. So why those are, there are reasons, right? So I mean, these are well documented reasons over time. But why the government insisted in going through this mechanism, I think at that time they did a very smart move in getting the West Container Terminal to go through a PPP model, and because it was just stuck for so many years, the East Container was just not moving. And we've tried this when I was a part of the Ministry of Finance and under the NAPPP, we tried to move it along and it just did not move, right? But I think the government was able to at least get the West Container going while the East Container was stuck. And I think Thilan is back as well, so maybe he can add to it.
Okay, Mr. Thilan, I'm not sure if you heard our question, but basically someone on the call wants to know why, despite the success of port sector PPPs, why the government is still persisting to try to do the East Terminal with government funding without actually engaging with private sector investments. Would you have an answer?
While he's getting ready, maybe I'll just add a couple of sentences. The South Harbour was the breakwater was financed by the ADB. And I was in on some of the early discussions. So earlier, the whole idea was that all three terminals, all three sites of the South Harbour would be private. But somewhere after 2005, it was agreed that one would have to be would be reserved for the state. Which one was left hanging? So the argument of the nationalist and trade unions was that the most desirable one was the East container terminal, and therefore that had to be kept for them. And that was what that fight was about. The Japanese-Indian collaboration for the East container terminal was defeated on the grounds that the most desirable one had to be kept for the state, for the Sri Lankan state. No economic argument. We are talking about sort of emotional arguments. And that West Container Terminal was the least desirable. And those guys said, okay, we'll take it. Now, I've been basically posing the question, so yeah, you got it, but now where's the money? Now, I have a feeling that you'll have to go back and revise whatever the agreement that they had with the ADB, or maybe there is wiggle room to bring in a PPP there, but that I don't know the details.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Samarajiva.
Okay, I can. I'm sorry, I
Mr.
can answer
Thilan,
now
hi.
because after I switched my call to my other device, I was blocked from entering the conference. So sorry about that. Not my fault.
No worries. So we got responses from Mr. Umair and Professor Samarajiva for the question. So I think that's good to go.
No, but what was the amount of the East Terminal? What did you say very quickly?
So basically, someone wanted to know why the government wasn't, going to secure private investments for it, and why they were going ahead with public investments when, in fact, PPPs in the ports sector have been quite successful.
I can answer that in one sentence, because governments love to do procurement against national interest.
Okay. So I hope whoever who asked that question got their response. So
it is
basically,
certainly against national interest for us not to be relying on a PPP for East Terminal, because the success of our port and our port becoming a hub port, because shipping lines became shareholders of our terminals. And to deprive such an opportunity of new types of shipping lines to become shareholders in deep water terminals just essentially compromises our national interest. And that you can see in the statistics about the declining importance of the Port of Colombo. Today, in my view, the Port of Colombo is dying a slow death unless we reform.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Thilan. So before we close, we are like 5 minutes past the time we were supposed to actually finish. I just want to ask the panelists just one last question, and if you all could keep your answers to it 15 seconds at the max, right? So could each of you share just one key reform you believe is absolutely critical for ensuring the sustainability of PPPs in Sri Lanka over the medium term? Just one reform under 15 seconds.
A political leadership that can control rampant fiscal indiscipline in the line ministries.
Okay. Mr. Umair?
I think it's about bringing in a standardized process for how PPPs are actually done in terms of procurement, and giving the knowledge and capacity to the government institutions that this is not just a source of money, but it is actually governance, risk mitigation, and a long-term public-private partnership.
All right. Professor Samarajiva?
The most important thing in successful PPPs are good legal agreements. You need to get top-class lawyers deployed. And in order to get top-class lawyers deployed, you need to have a strong team within the government.
All right. Thank you very much to our panelists. We're really grateful to the fact that you all joined us here today on this call. For those on Zoom and watching us live, please make sure to read our policy brief. You can access it on our Advocata Institute website. It's very informative of the current status of PPPs. So please do go ahead and access it. I think someone will probably send the link for it on the chat box. So kindly please have a read through and let us know if you have any thoughts and email us any kind of feedback that you have. Thank you very much and good evening, everyone.
Thank you very much.